one of the key concepts you want to understand within photography is how to compose an image. When you compose an image, what that really means is how do the different elements within your frame work together to make a satisfying image. You don't just want to randomly take a picture and not think about how those different elements are working. And knowing different composition strategies is really going to help you more consistently produce good images. Now, this isn't as much relevant for something like shooting action or sports photography where you're just reacting to moments and hoping to get a good picture. But for almost all other photography, these are some really good ideas to give you kind of a base level idea of what you want to shoot and how you want to compose it. So we're going to walk through each one, and I'm just going to talk through how they kind of work. The first composition strategy that you want to think about here is the classic rule of thirds. Now, what the rule of thirds suggests is that a frame is split into 3 different areas, both vertically and horizontally. And that's done so by these 2 lines that cut through the image. What that leaves you with are these intersecting areas that fall onto the frame in areas where you want to try to place your image, place whatever's there. So for instance, here we have, looks like some kind of like lookout tower. It might be on a beach. It looks like that's water there. And so that lighthouse or lookout tower is placed along the right thirds of the image. Now, you could actually put it down here as well or up here, but the idea is just that you're trying to switch it up from being right dead center of the frame. That's what you don't want in a rule of thirds composition. Now, if it's on this side or if it's on this side, that doesn't really matter, but you're just trying to not put it right in the dead center. The next composition strategy is called balancing elements. And with balancing elements, what you're looking at here is having 2 or more, but generally it's 2 elements that work off of one another. So for instance here we have, again, this kind of lifeguard station and then a power plant in the background. Not only does it make kind of an editorial commentary on maybe like pollution or industrial America, all that kind of stuff, but it balances out the 2 on either side of the image. If you didn't have this back here, or you didn't have this lifeguard stand right here, it would feel overweighted to one side. And again, that's okay, again, if you're going for something like a rule of thirds, but if you're trying to balance it, you need those different elements to sit there and work together. Here's an example that a student took a couple years back, I think several years back actually at this point. And this balances the 2 runners along with the middle runner. And it's nice because they're all balanced at about the same distance from one another. And that's just, again, really pleasant for the viewer. I'll also point to this image later on when I talk about depth, because the image I have in here for some reason is going to get really pixelated. The next composition strategy is a classic as well, and that's leading lines. What you can see here in this leading lines image is the line, which is both the road, the side paint, and the dividing line, that leads us into the image and draws us back into whatever might be back here. Maybe it's a town, maybe it's just this kind of little tree area. But the key thing is it doesn't exit again. It doesn't lead back out of the image. Now, a leading line will generally come from the bottom or the bottom third of the image. It'd be pretty rare that it would come from the top or just the sides. It could happen, but generally, again, it's going to be that bottom third, and then it's going to enter into the middle of the image. Here's another example of one that's a little bit more subtle, but again, it brings in from the bottom third of the image and leads to something in the background. Generally, what I'm going to be looking for and what is satisfying with a leading lines picture is having something centered in the back of the image. So for instance, this next example has a runner here at the end of this footbridge or whatever this is. And then the grout lines or whatever these lines are between the pavers, that leads the viewer to the individual back there. As, by the way, as does these handrails along the side. This is also a really good illustration of the next one, which is called Symmetry and Patterns. And that's where you have, if you split the image right down the middle, it's similar to balancing elements, but balancing elements doesn't need to be exactly the same. Symmetry and Patterns does. And if you split it right down the middle, you get exactly the same thing basically on both sides. Now, obviously, you notice this trash can, you notice these flowers in here. So it's not exactly the same, but it gives you the same feel, and that's that symmetry. This isn't as good of an illustration of patterns, but if I went back to this one, this is a good illustration of patterns. The patterns of all that, again, brickwork or pavers or whatever this is down here. That pattern is really satisfying to look at. You see these all the time in nature. So for instance, if you look at honeycombs, that shows patterns. If you go to your house on your outside, you might look for a pattern in a fence line. Fences oftentimes utilize patterns because it's really satisfying. Okay, this next one is Viewpoint. Viewpoint's really cool in that it changes things up for the audience. Now, what I don't want you to think here is that Viewpoint is only something that's seen like from above, or it's something viewing like a landscape. That's not really what Viewpoint means. What Viewpoint is talking about is changing your viewpoint from what you would usually see. So most people, when they shoot something, they're going to stand at like 5 foot to 6 foot, and they're going to hold the camera at their face, and they're going to shoot whatever it is at that viewpoint. The idea behind Viewpoint in a composition is to change up your viewpoint. So an example of this would be like if you're shooting a young kid or something like that, and you get lower to the ground to illustrate their world around them, that's a good use of Viewpoint. Similarly with an animal, like if you have a family pet, which I know some of you do, you might get lower to the ground and take that picture of that family pet. You could do this as well. You can get up on a bridge and shoot something below. But the key thing is there should still be something that's the subject of the image. This is really satisfying because there's still this individual here who draws us in as a viewer. Otherwise, frankly, this could be kind of disorienting because we don't know how big or small this is. This person helps give us what's understood as scale within the viewpoint. Okay, our next one is less a composition strategy as kind of like a rule of thumb, which is think about what's in your background because it can really make or break an image. Here, obviously there's nothing in the background, and that really helps the violinist stand out against that blank background. If you had all the other musicians in the background, it's not like it's a bad image, but it might just be distracting to the audience. Our next one is depth, and this is the one I said isn't a very good picture, and I'm sorry for that. But what this is trying to illustrate is in a depth picture, your foreground is blurry and your background is blurry and the midground is in focus. So if I go back to this image here, our foreground is blurry, our midground is in focus, these two runners, and then the background is out of focus. That's a great illustration of depth. And here, this is supposed to be showing it, but for some reason it's really pixelated, and I apologize for that. But this should be in focus, this is out of focus, and then the foreground is also out of focus. And that gives the illusion of depth. Okay, and our next one, our last composition strategy, is framing. And in framing, you're looking for natural frames that help to focus the viewer on whatever you want them to focus on. So for instance here, you have the individual and he's framed within this rocky kind of opening, which is really cool. In the next one, you have this nice, rock island out in the middle of the ocean, probably, and it's shot through all of these, trees and brambles and all that kind of stuff. And then our last example here is if you were at a wedding, this would be a really good idea, right? To get your couple to stand somewhere that you've already scouted out and you've said this would be a really good place for having my framing take place. All right, the next one is not a composition strategy, so don't turn it in. It's not a composition strategy, the next one, okay? So warning, don't be fooled. But the next one is simply think about your cropping. That's a composition, like awareness technique. It's similar to background. Just think about your cropping. Don't take a picture and just leave it at that. So for instance here, we have this really nice picture of a Jesuit soccer player, and they're about to hopefully score a goal. This is a good picture, But if we cropped it, we could get rid of this referee here, and we could get rid of this player over here, which are a little bit distracting. So then you have this image, which is actually a really satisfying sports picture. And it allows for also this player's on the rule of thirds, and then this player's on the rule of thirds, and we're about to see this ball get struck, which is really, really nice. So I'm going to actually stop us right there with these composition strategies 1.0. There will also be a composition strategies 2.0 and 3.0. But feel free to review this whenever you need to if you're trying to figure out what you need to shoot exactly and how to make it look as good as possible.